Okay, hi, welcome everyone to the second episode of Hosting Art. I'm Diana Boros, professor of political theory at St. Mary's College of Maryland. And I'm here today with my friend and collaborator, Mark Cooper, internationally recognized artist. He's known most of all for his site-specific and large-scale works, installations, and public commissions. He's also a published author. I have his book right here, Making Art Together: How Collaborative Art Making Can Transform Kids, Classrooms, and Communities. And Mark has done really, really interesting work, both making beautiful art that I love to look at, but also art that makes a difference, changes lives in classrooms, out in the public world. And I'm so excited, Mark, to talk to you about all of this today. So I wanted to start by asking you about some of the projects that you've created. Obviously, you have so many projects that I'm sure you're working on now and that you're thinking about for the future. But when I first came upon your work, I found your project a very sort of large scale, over a long period of time project that was called Stop the Violence. And this was now a couple of decades ago, right, that this began?
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that project was all about, how it started?
Well, um, it actually started, in some ways, I've done collaboration throughout my creative practice from the very beginning. It was just in my instinct to collaborate with other artists. And at one point in Boston, for New Year's Eve day and evening, this organization, First Night, got created, which ended up having versions in hundreds of cities around the United States and the world. And it was basically a celebration of the arts for New Year's Eve day and night. And they asked me to create a sculpture that individuals could sort of write resolutions on, participate in. And it had to show up in the Boston Commons at like 6 a.m. and then be taken away at midnight. So I had to build something that was durable, because it's the winter in Boston, which could be snow and sleet and rain and freezing. But I could also, put up and take down. So basically I created this 24-foot long, 16-foot high, 8-foot deep sculpture based on the Janus myth of looking forward to the future and back at the past on both sides, and had a number of people help me, and barrels of markers. And I think over 2 million people interacted with that sculpture, and in so many languages. And they proposed marriage, they said they would lose weight, they just wrote. It was amazing, and it was a real lesson to me about public art. Even if it was temporary, it could have huge impact. And at the same time, I was fortunate enough to be in an important exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston. And, the Boston Globe reviewer said it was genius, and everybody loved, my participation. But the museum was happy with 50 or 100,000 visitors. And I thought, oh, wow, even though it had a very long run of a few months, it just made me appreciate that public art was really up to me at the quality, but it was a way to reach people that would never perhaps go to a gallery or museum. And early on, somebody saw that and asked me to do a project with a group called Youth in Effect, the letter in Effect. So I met with these young people, and we sort of discussed what they wanted to do and what they wanted to sort of make their art about, and approached the billboard company, and they donated 3 billboards, and we created 3 billboards. One was anti-smoking, one was anti-violence, and can't remember exactly what the third was. And I was like, wow, this is such an effective approach. The head of the Children's Museum in Washington, D.C. found out about it and invited me to do a big project.
This was the Stop the Violence project. This was the
Stop the
beginning
Violence
of it.
project. Yep.
Okay. Was this in the
So
90s?
I approached the Washington Metro system and said, well, we're doing this project about getting along and against violence. And, we'd like to use public spaces. And they gave us 1,200 spaces, the back of buses, the side of buses, backlit dioramas like in airports and the subway system. And so I worked with young people from Um, starting with the Children's Museum had a project for 100 young people who basically been thrown out of a lot of other schools, and that's what, so I worked with them, but they helped arrange young people from both Maryland and Virginia and the district, and I also did a project with Corcoran. And so the goal was to make original art um, that would be up for a few years in the Washington area about getting along. And just I based it when I grew up. People would litter all the time. They would throw trash out of their car windows, and there was a big anti-littering campaign, and it actually was effective.
Right.
And you could sort of say the anti-cigarette smoking campaign is somewhat effective. It hasn't stopped it completely, but it made me think, just appreciate short, attainable goals. You don't have to change the world all at once, but you could actually move it forward and make an impact. So, that I would go to Washington every week for 2 years, and work for a couple days with, young people. And we ended up making 1,200 advertising space, art objects, 10 billboards, a sculpture for the Corcoran Museum that's permanent, a sculpture for the Children's Museum. Um, and that whole project from the get-go, and when I do those kind of projects, I show examples of past collaborative projects I've done to the participants, and then they get to decide, well, we want to make a billboard, or we want to make a sculpture. And then we talk about, okay, does everybody want to have a little window for their own personal image or language, or should we all agree it's question marks everywhere? Or so there's
Yeah.
kind of a debate and discussion, and part of the democratic process is in developing these projects. So they, in every step of the way, they have ownership. And it does take till the very end for them really to understand like the process. But I also realized very quickly that it's quite useful to have places of respect to exhibit the collaborative public art, because among other things, it helps the participants have a sense of being able to succeed at something. And I think quite often in our society, we don't learn, maybe in sports a little bit in some things, but just that everybody can succeed. Part of the underlying notion is the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts,
Yeah.
and that it's not about somebody can draw a flower perfectly and somebody can't. It's the humanity of everybody's expression really matters and reinforces each other. And it actually triggers the viewer's kind of mind and interest to sort of make associations and see what they bring to it and what they could relate to it. So there's lots of levels to these projects.
Yeah.
And I've had the good fortune of doing quite a number since. One of the things I've learned is that at the very end, it's useful to have some kind of evaluation or reflection, not to prove to a funder or anybody else that it was a success, but if you talk about, like, well, what should we title this, or what do you think about it? The experience is then transferable to other things in life. And that's not only just making art, that could be becoming an engineer or a dentist or a plumber or anything. Just like, what's it take to do a good job and succeed? And another thing that's useful is when it has the opportunity to get attention, whether it's a news show on television or an article in a local paper, even if it's only one or two of the participants who gets interviewed, all the participants know it could be them, and
Yeah.
all of the participants feel that they have a sense of ownership. So there's been a huge kind of learning curve takeaway from being involved in these collaborative projects, for sure.
Yeah, that's so many points in there that I'd love to talk about. You mentioned, so first of all, this project started in the 90s. Am I right about that?
Yep.
And you said it went on for about 2 years that you worked with these
2 years,
at-risk youths?
yeah.
Two
So
years.
it
That's
it,
a
it went
long
on for two
time.
years, and then I had 2 years of a project with the Whitney Museum in New York, where I worked with young people from all 5 boroughs, culminating in 2 exhibitions at the Whitney Philip Morris space, 10
Were the two
billboards.
projects related or were they totally
They
distinct?
were both projects about getting along and against violence.
Okay.
So, I mean, I looked around and I thought, well, there's so many things one could, have your ideas be about in art.
Yeah.
But, I was pretty troubled by all the violence in our society. And I thought, that how do you change people's notion, that, I mean, because there's so much copycat. We see it right now. It's like shootings in schools everywhere. And it's like it never happened before. And, I thought, well, we need to get back to feeling good about doing well by others and putting good energy out into the world. And, and that comes through, movies and TV and art and just, like having it be in the culture that, like, no, getting along is what's important, not, fighting with each other. So it just seemed like, this is a message that needs to just be out there, much like don't litter or,
Right. Don't smoke. It's bad for
yeah,
you. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's great. And when I first came upon your work, I was like, wow, this is a project that not only is obviously so important and has probably had a significant effect on so many at-risk youth in 2 different cities, right? DC and New York. Like, but it could also be replicated relatively
right,
easily all around the world, right? So this is something that you could, which I find really interesting, public and social artworks that can be easily replicated. I find some of them to me are some of the most compelling work, right? Because it's like you can take it and give that same experience to all different communities in different ways. And that doesn't mean you're also not sort of privileging one community, because we know that often it is our big cities that are privileged, right? Our rural and suburban neighborhoods are often left out of public art experiences, which I think is a shame. And then even within cities, sometimes certain neighborhoods are privileged over others. So I think it's really cool when you can sort of replicate a project, move it around. Like you said, you worked with all different, youths from all different types of programs and institutions. And so you're like getting that mix of students. You're also bringing them together into conversation with each other. So thereby
right.
like creating a larger community, right? Pulling them out of their singular communities and like combining them into a larger community, which I think is really cool. I love that project. I do with my own students in class, I do like a really small scale version of this where we do at the end of every semester. So they have their own sort of public art projects that they have to propose and then execute on campus. But at the end of every semester, we do this project it's actually a introductory class, like a college introductory class, which means they're not all majors. The students are from a diversity of, disciplinary interests, which I think is really cool. And at the end, they have to do a project where they create a class collage, and then we determine where that collage will be, exhibited on campus. And so to some extent, the project's very simple, right? But they have such a wonderful time doing it because I let them know, just like you said, you mentioned like, you want to make sure that they have that ownership over it. There's that conversation, that debate, that dialogue at the beginning to determine like, okay, how are we going to do this? So they decide all of that, right? What is this going to look like? What is the message you're trying to convey? How are you going to work together? Who figures out who's cutting and who's pasting and who's choosing and who's right? Where do you want it to go on campus? How are we going to make that happen? The sort of politics of it, right? How are we going to sort of figure out where the best place is to hang this work? What will we title it? And that's I let them know that like, that's part of their grade is not just making a collage, right? But is working together. Like literally the actual collaboration of it is what I'm sort of watching for. And sometimes at first they're like, well, but how do I know this? And tell me what to do this. And I say, no, you can't. Like, let's just figure it out. Talk about it. Sometimes we do polls, sometimes we just have like open dialogues, but at the end, they're always so, first of all, the work is beautiful. I have to show you the latest one. It's beautiful. They made a big tree, and it sort of represents rising up and growing out of difficulty into sort of the beauty of the world. It's lovely. And they do beautiful work, but they're also so proud of it at the end, which I'm sure that you have many experiences of seeing that, and what a pleasure.
Every time. They're
Every
like,
time.
even if their
Yeah.
piece is at the bottom of the sculpture and you have to crawl underneath to see it, their
Right.
contribution, it's like
Yes.
theirs. It's fascinating, to tell you
Yeah.
the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And I'd love to do that because I feel like, Mark, you are also an educator. Mark also teaches, he's a professor at Boston College, and the director of undergraduate studies for studio art. And in the classroom, right, as an educator, yes, my job is to disseminate knowledge, obviously, right, to share knowledge and to help them to become more critical thinkers, etc. But I also feel like a big part of my job, and I would imagine you agree, is to like encourage them to take ownership over their own work and their own lives, their own thoughts, right, to become
Most
empowered,
important.
to become
Yeah.
proud, right? Like I love to see, especially students that are maybe a bit more shy or less certain of themselves, and to sort of watch them like blossom. And I love to encourage them. And I think art is an amazing vehicle for that. That's why we have art therapy and we have art in our prisons and art in our hospitals, right? Because I think there's no debate that art has a really powerful effect on the well-being of individuals, like just broadly. Like I think that it can have the capacity to make you feel good and make you feel like you know yourself more, and like your voice could be louder and you can connect with others more, which is something else that I want to talk about today. Because so with hosting art, the title of this series, I was thinking, and I wonder what you think, Mark, but I was thinking about it in two ways. And I know we've talked about this before in other conversations we've had. One, I feel like, I see it as sort of like an invitation to ask everybody to host art, like to host art, like in their lives, in their hearts, to sort of take art seriously, to ask them to like see art in a different way, right? And I would argue often art is not seen as sort of integral to the human experience or integral to a vibrant society. It's seen as something like beautiful and lovely, but like a hobby that you do on the weekend, something that's sort of secondary to the important stuff, right? And so I feel like part of what I would like hosting art to convey is like a request to sort of see art more holistically, right?
Yeah.
And in a more powerful way, and in a way where like it could affect like every sort of type of work and every type of interaction we have in society. But then the other way, which was relevant to what I was just saying, is the idea of the notion that art itself can serve as a host, right? It has the capacity to serve as a host, just like you were just describing. Like it can host conversation, it can host engagement, it can host collaborative experiences. And I would argue ultimately it can host feelings of empathy, like feelings of connection, feelings of understanding, of community, right? So that's how I'm sort of thinking about this broadly. And I think that your work in general, what you just described, but also other work that you've done, really speaks to that idea of like asking. It's like in the work that you're doing, you're asking the world to see art in this more broad, holistic, important way. But you're also creating situations where empathy, community, conversation, dialogue, understanding, all of that is fostered. And I don't know, I see that in a lot of the sort of the work that you've done, both in exhibits that you've created and also work that you've done in classrooms, because you've done a lot of that work as well, like in the education realm. So, I mean, can you speak a little bit to how you think art can serve as a host for community, for empathy, for dialogue, for understanding, for all of those types of
Sure.
connections?
I mean, you have brought up so many good points. I wish I would have had a pen and paper and keeping notes of all these talking points to get back to. But I'll just go through a few that come up. So I've had the good fortune to, well, for 4 or 5 years, I taught a group of teachers from 9 North African and Middle East countries who were on fellowship to come like just work with me to learn my approach to collaboration, who've then gone back to their individual countries and done countrywide collaborative projects.
So cool.
So and I've had the good fortune of having museum exhibitions all over the world, but most recently quite a lot in China and Vietnam and Korea, and I've also taught workshops on collaboration, and not just there, but even to like MBA students. I mean, the range of who it applies to is pretty broad. And I think one thing that I bring to this notion of collaboration is to bring individual voices, and that bring your strength. It's not like a compromise. It's like, how can we bring, what we each contribute to the conversation? So, I think that's pretty important. And for sure, when you share something and you succeed, you're building community, you're building empathy, and you're also reaching viewers who can identify with the topics. And when the process is transparent, they understand it could be them that did it. It doesn't have to be just those people who made it. Um, so I think that the potential is enormous. And one of the things you brought up, and we've sort of put into place in the studio art program at Boston College, is we have majors, we have minors, and we also have many students who take a few courses, that are whatever, biology majors, or in the business school and the nursing school. And we've just included a creative thinking minor, where instead of focusing on only one discipline like drawing, maybe you take several. You still have to take a certain amount of courses. You have to take an issues and approaches course and a minor course, but you, as a student, we all need to be creative in whether we're a doctor or a nurse, or in business, or trying to invent something. We have to think creatively, and I think that comes from practice and experience. You don't just once every 6 months decide you're going to be creative. So just
That's a great
including
point.
this
Yeah,
process, I think that impacts everyone and gives everybody an opportunity to participate. And in my teaching, what I found is the most important thing I can do is help students believe in themselves and trust themselves, and learn how to do their own research for what excites them, and learn how to develop an idea that they want to add to the conversation about that idea in the world.
yeah,
And so rather than, okay, you only are going to learn this technique and this technique and this technique, the technique of actually developing an idea, researching it, and finding out what you need to know to succeed and how to present it in the most powerful way, I think that liberates people, so that when they're out in the world and they're no longer, in a college environment or educational environment, they don't have to be in a class to sort of be fulfilled in their creative life. They've
yeah,
developed, an approach that allows them to know how artists think and do things. And that same approach applies to everything, we do, you know, building houses, you name it. It could be
yeah.
architecture, it could be engineering, it could be science, really everything.
Yeah, yes, I love all of that. And I think your point that you made a few minutes ago, you were like, creativity is not something we do every 6 months. And I love that you've developed a creative thinking minor. I think that's so important and valuable. Because to me, and I think this is what you were saying, creativity is like it's a skill. It's like a muscle, right? It's something that you should be taught to do and to practice. And so I think that's really an amazing sort of capacity that art has to encourage that. And especially that's why, I'm so fascinated by public and socially engaged artworks, because I love art. I love art in all mediums. I love beauty. I love wonder. I love awe. I love to just like experience art. But I think that art that asks you to participate and asks you to engage, like the projects that you've been describing, it does something different, right? It asks you to stop just being this sort of passive spectator, but rather be this like
Right.
active participant, thereby like using that muscle, right? Sort of learning how to, even if you're like, well, I don't know art. I don't do art. I'm not an artist, as so many people will tell you, right? But then they have this experience and they're like, well, maybe like I'm a tiny bit of an artist, like they have the right. They're like, wow, that was like really, really cool. And then they have that
Because
moment of
people
pride.
think they have to have a certain skill
Yeah,
set to be an artist.
right,
And then, when you say, well, actually, you could stack bricks, and that could be, you know what I mean? Or you
yeah,
could paint the background blue and put yellow polka dots, and that's a contribution, I think. And then, oh, well, you did yellow polka dots. What if you put red circles around them?
right,
Like one foot in front of the next. And that's how artists develop. It's like, if you think of a traditional painter, they don't only do one painting, they do a series. And usually the
right.
first one or two is kind of clunky, and you're working through the process, and that's pretty normal.
Yeah, I love a series in art in general. Like in general, I enjoy that and seeing that process. Um, absolutely. So one thing, well, two things that I wanted to bring up also. So we're talking about our experiences, especially yours in your classrooms and mine in my classrooms. And like, that's, wonderful when we can bring that to students at Boston College and St. Mary's College. But like, what I think is so important about public art is, now think about if we can bring that feeling of like, of engagement, of empowerment, of, like we were describing, just sheer pride, knowledge about the self, right? Practicing creativity, learning how to collaborate, learning how to work with other people, learning how to think creatively, and we can bring it to the public. To me, it's just like a win-win-win-win-win, right? Like, I feel like that's such an amazing thing to be doing, both and many different like versions of bringing it to the public. There's sort of, I like you in the first project you were discussing, working with students from all different, from young people from all different sort of places around the city and bringing them together. But then also projects that are, literally out on the street or in some capacity public, whether indoors or outdoors. I think is really, really vital, because if what you and I are saying is even a little bit true, right? Then we need to be sharing this with as many people as possible, right? We need, like, I think it's really important to try to provide that experience to more people, especially in a world in which I would argue that often that experience is, maybe I don't want to say devalued, but not valued as top priority, and not sort of given out, loosely to the public at large. So I feel like it's sort of part of the role of, artists and thinkers who care about these things, who believe in this, to get it out there, to get it into the hands of as many people as possible.
Well, one thing that with all those projects, let's say the Whitney project,
Yeah.
the art got shown at the Whitney, but then it went back to the schools permanently.
Oh, I
And
love that.
so it was
Yeah.
and that's true of almost every project, because you shouldn't just go to this one special place to experience it. You need to live with it. And one of the things I noticed was, in some of the schools I went to, having a sense of self-respect and pride in your neighborhood and where you lived, which is a place for public art. I mean,
Right.
it's really important, instead of it just being kind of a wasteland with, nothing to look at and nothing positive around and nothing. And at the same time, parallel, not at the same time, but I've been involved with this project around environmental and equity issues around recycled clothing. And there was a group at Boston College that had been working on this for 10 years. Dean DeVoy and several, students, graduate students, undergraduate students, researching issues. And they decided that they wanted some kind of public art presence to draw attention to it. So they invited me to sort of build a sculptural installation. And then along with that, there's a website, there's videos, there's interactive things. We made posters, and it's amazing, what the physical manifestation of this idea is very powerful, and it really starts conversations. And we had we were able to exhibit it at the McMullen Museum at Boston College, at the Smithsonian. It was with the School of Public Health at BU, and then the BU Student Center. It's going to go to the University of Washington, to this beautiful new building that they've just built in Seattle, and
Awesome.
hopefully to your school. And it's amazing. And it's, I think there's a power to having this thing that people can then have a conversation about.
Yeah.
And I had no idea, honestly, the crisis that recycled clothing has created environmentally. It's perhaps the second biggest problem,
Yeah.
in our environment. And there's all kinds of other, and it ends up in poor communities, and it creates, toxic problems, and and the transportation of it back and forth. There's so many things. And it's a kind of a remarkable collaboration, because everybody brings their contribution to it, including a professor and a student who are making a simulator. So you can put a piece of clothing in and see what toxins it gives off. But viewers can see that. And an interactive website that has the history of recycled clothing, but a place for people to sort of blog and come up with solutions. And just different people bring different skills to this, collaborative project, which is really kind of awesome. And kind of a good model, I think.
Yeah, so everyone can find it. What is the name of the project?
Um, well, the sculpture is
Website.
called Aftermath, and I don't know that. So that's how I see it, but
I like
I'll
that
have to let
title.
you know if there's a broader name than that.
I like it. Aftermath makes sense from everything
So
we've
even that was so once they asked me to do it, we put out a video and a call to the community, students, teachers, staff, to contribute recycled clothing with an explanation of the thing. So from the get-go, it was collaborative in
right.
terms of everybody contributing and understanding what addressing the issue. Um, and every step along the way, there's been these, opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah, I love that. In all these projects, I mean, from the very beginning of our conversation today, we're talking about, messages to come together and not be violent, or messages to stop smoking, or messages to not litter, or whatever. All of these are ultimately, political claims, right? They're political needs that in some sense, in some traditional sense, it would be the state that would be in charge of sort of trying to get out these messages to the people. But artists have this really like special role, and I think like deeply important, unique role in communicating with the public about political issues from a different perspective, right? And bringing a different sense of feeling to learning about these issues. And so, for example, with this project, with Aftermath, talking about recycled clothing and the environmental crisis like related to like the fast clothing industry is really significant, and something that maybe a lot of people, don't know enough about. But, how are you going to teach people about it in a way that, that is going to be accessible and still like interesting and fun and creative and like beautiful, right? With all the colors. I mean, I've seen it. I think it's beautiful, right? Lots and very, very colorful, lots of layers. We'll bring it to them through these artistic experiences. And collaborative from the beginning, collaborative throughout, collaborative at the end. It's also sort of showing what I think a lot of socially engaged artists, right? So artists that in like are particularly committed to creating art in which the interactive capacity of the art is the art itself, right? Like that the most
Right.
important part of the art is like making the art, rather than the end result. Is that often these are deeply political works, sometimes so deeply and overtly political, they don't, they sort of are very much on that line between sort of art and political action. And I think that's really like something that's getting more and more significant as, we have obviously numerous problems in our world today, and artists have stepped up more and more to sort of take a part in sending messages to the public, in creative ways. That also, going back to our previous point, is also like teaching creative thinking, like you said, right? It's
Yeah.
teaching that collaboration. So it's not just like, hey, I learned something about recycled clothes. Hey, I saw a cool art piece. It's like, I had this experience, right? I learned something about myself. I worked with someone and I did this. I added to this thing, and
Right.
now I'm a part of this thing, right? Which to me is really different than just like, I got a pamphlet about, recycled clothing. And I learned about it, right? It's
No,
different, like,
it's
right?
visceral. When you see
Yeah.
something, the experience is visceral. And for whatever it's worth, um, I just had an exhibition at Caiaphas Gallery. The title was Bloomin', like flowers blooming out of a tough winter. And the whole exhibition, it was just me with some collaboration with other artists help, participating. It was the idea that you need to have something positive and optimistic in the world as
Mhm.
well. You can't just look at all of the negative. So I guess my point is, there's a place for beauty and there's a place for everything, and our world needs all of it. And so, collaboration doesn't have to just be, the environment's falling apart. It can be about, there's any number of ideas that one could put forward.
Yeah, but even all the sort of negative things like, okay, the world is falling apart, right? The environment is in crisis. But then you create a project like Aftermath, right? And suddenly that which is, I mean, it doesn't mean the situation is solved, right? It's not that we've sort of
Right.
solved the environmental or political condition on for which the project was sort of built, but you created beauty in addressing that issue.
Yeah.
And that to
Yeah,
me is what it's all about. Like at the very beginning of this conversation, you said something about how it's the little things, like little by little, right? It's not about sort of solving the world's problems
that's right.
in one art project, right? But little by little, you're bringing people together, you're engaging people, you're empowering people, you're giving people a voice, you're giving, helping them to feel proud. And so to me, we should be doing this. We should be taking all the things in the world that if we think about them for too long will just make us cry, right? All these really just sort of
Right.
terrible crises. But if we can bring people together to try to solve them, even in little ways, even in just, a 1 day project or a temporary installation or creative experience in a classroom, whatever it might be, you're like little by little, you're still taking that which is difficult, I think, and creating beauty out of it and bringing people together, creating community, you know?
Absolutely. It
So
reminds me, several years ago, it was the 20th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, and I got invited to create a sculpture, to commemorate that on the Boston College campus through the German embassy was part of it, and the German department at Boston College and the administration. So I created this huge sculpture, and I had cans of spray paint and students for a
awesome.
month could sort of write on this big sculpture. And it was amazing. They said all kinds of meaningful, important things and nothing horrible. And everybody had a voice. And a funder who has funded projects of mine saw it and said, I'll help support, send this to anywhere in the world. This is so good. And it ended up going to North Ireland for the reconciliation process. And it got shipped in a 40-foot container, set up in Strabane near Derry. And then they repainted the whole thing. I went for the, opening, and I communicated a lot to them, but they had sort of performances, and they had youth from, both Catholic and Protestants talking to each other for the first time, and it was about tearing down walls. The walls in our mind that keep us separate, the literal, if you're Protestant, don't cross this street, if you're Catholic, don't cross. So it didn't completely solve all the problems in North Ireland, but it was a piece of like going from the conflict that they had forever to finding a way to live together and work together. And so that's like a perfect example of, that one thing alone isn't going to change things, but it can be a step along the way to changing things.
Yeah, I love that. I love that project. And I like the sort of the literal and the metaphorical sense in which, people are coming together to tear down a wall. And I like that in a couple of ways, because when you have people taking out cans of spray paint in Boston, right, spray painting on a wall, that is an experience in and of itself, right? That could just be like a cool collaborative art experience. But at the same time, when you're sort of spreading the awareness that, hey, 20 years ago, there was a really significant revolution in which this wall was very significant, both literally and metaphorically, and
Right,
people wrote all over it because they were in pain and because they were revolting and because they
right,
wanted peace and because they wanted democracy. Then even if it's just a little bit, every time someone picks up that spray paint, that they're aware that they're connecting to that political moment, to that political
absolutely.
experience. And
Yeah,
I would argue thinking about it a lot more deeply again than just reading it in the textbook, like we all read in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, right? Instead, it's like, okay, wait, I'm people did this and they were feeling something really different than what I'm experiencing today, but I get to like share just a little piece of it. It's like you said the word visceral. It's like experiencing, political moments in a different way than just learning about them or reading about them or being taught about them. It's like engaging with the
yeah.
experience. I think that's really, really cool and really important. But
Well,
yeah,
experiential learning. It is
exactly.
experiential learning. And
Literally.
that is
Yeah.
like in your body. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
people say we learn things by walking around and moving. You know what I mean? We learn many different ways, not just reading.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Absolutely. And to the issue of addressing political issues, I I hear this all the time, right? Where I'm really devoted to the idea that art can make a political difference in a very real way, that it changes the world because it changes people. And
right,
at the end of the day, people are the components of the world. Like I really believe that, right? So, you know, coming from a political perspective, we're trained as political scientists to examine institutions, to examine institutional change, processes, systems. And while that's all obviously valuable, that component of just sort of looking at people, looking at those little things, looking at the conversations, the dialogues, those little moments of community, those little moments of shared understanding, I just think are so, so, so important to ultimately, dealing with and conquering some of these, various crises we have in the world. Because, like, at the end of the day, I really believe it is the little moments, and it is the people,
Yeah.
and it is those conversations that create that empathy and that understanding. And so bringing that project to North Ireland, I mean, that's perfect, right? What an incredible way to also connect that experience to the like Central and Eastern European experience from decades
Yeah.
ago. So there's like another, like, it's tearing down walls, but it's creating bridges,
Yeah, absolutely.
all at the
Well,
same
I did work with a group of young people from Israel and Palestine who came to Boston, and it was building bridges through art was the foundation, the organization, and they were using art as a way to, talk about issues and you know
Yeah, using it
and
as the medium itself. And that's what I think is cool about socially engaged art, is that many of those artists will tell you that the medium of their art is people, which I
right.
think was a really cool way to think about it. And obviously there are other mediums being utilized, right? There's sculpture, there's music, there's performance, whatever it might be. But that at the end of the day, without the people, the art does not exist, or it is, at
Yeah,
least
yeah,
it's not complete, right? And so to think about like the medium being people, and then to think about like the medium of art being people and the medium of like politics being people, it makes so much sense to like bring these, to bring these worlds together, consciously, right? And
yeah.
like the work that you do to consciously say, I'm gonna like create this moment, right? In this place at this time, and invite people to share in it. I think
So
that's
part of my approach to collaborative projects is to have a framework that's so strong it embraces whatever the contributions are. So they
great.
could be polka dots, or they could be language, or they could be images, or they could be all of the above, and it could be, sort of an outline of a map of the world, or it could be an organic shape. I mean, but just having a framework that sort of allows for this bigger thing, which is everybody's participation, to sort of sing and succeed. And at the time of that Whitney show's exhibitions, an interviewer was talking to the curator, and what did she think about the work? And she said, well, really what matters is conceptually that everybody participated.
Right.
But it had to look good to be shown. And, I mean, she didn't go there, but, I think you need it. It can't just be a good idea, and it can't just be pretty. There needs to be some combination of, if you want it to excel and really move people.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that process that you just described is like, it's by definition democratic. It's inclusive and democratic, right? It's like it is becoming as it becomes, right? It is made of the people and what they decide. And certainly you want the end result to be compelling, but I think what's cool about so many of these like participatory projects is that the end result, I don't know, need not be compelling in the traditional way. Sometimes I find what
Right.
makes it so compelling, right, is not that it necessarily looks a particular way, but that it shows me the collaboration. Like it's in my face. I'm like, wow. Like if I was looking at your wall, I'd be like, oh my God, like look at all that spray paint. Look at all the individual statements. Look at all the people
Yeah.
that went to this one place and did this thing together at the same time. To me, that's like every time it's mind blowing, and it's moving. I think
Yeah.
it moves me. I think it's an emotional experience. When I've seen, some of these projects come to life, it moves me. I've been brought to tears numerous times just watching. And I don't mean in the moment that it's happening. I mean the end result, just seeing it. And I'm just moved that like, wow, this happened. Like look
Yeah.
at all this coming together. This happened. All these people came together. And that to me is, it's ultimately what art and politics is all about. So I just think that's really cool. Um, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I love your work and I love talking to you about this stuff. So I really, really appreciate it. And thank you again, Mark's book, for everybody that's interested. Thank you
Well,
so much.
Diana, thank you for, your interest and your clarity and, where you're coming from.
I
So
appreciate
thank
it. Thank you. Thank you so much. I so enjoyed this. We'll have to do it again sometime. Thank you, Mark. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.